Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. We are here for a special panel, Democracy in America, with a question mark. This will be a discussion with Dionne Jr., Jeffrey Isaac, William Kristol, and Claire Potter, and will be moderated by Jeffrey Goldfarb. Before we start the discussion, just a few housekeeping rules. The event is being recorded, so will be your questions that you address to the panel. Just keep that in mind. Speaking of questions, there's a Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please put your questions there at any point during the panel. You can drop your question and the moderator will address this in the second part of the event. Also keep an eye on the chat. I will be sharing some information about, I will put the full bios there, but also information about the sponsors of this event, which is the Democracy Seminar and the Trans-Regional Center for Democratic Studies at the New School. And Jeffrey Goldfarb will tell you more about the Democracy Seminar and TCDS. Thank you again for everybody for being here. And I will pass it. I'll pass the mic to Jeffrey Goldfarb, who is Professor Emeritus at the New School for Social Research and also the convener of the Democracy Seminar. Jeff.
Thank you, Lala. So the Democracy Seminar, which is sponsoring this event, started in the mid-1980s as an exchange between critical thinkers and activists across the old Iron Curtain. Back then, our concerns were mostly about the struggle for democracy in communist-dominated Europe, and as well, the insufficiencies of democracy in the West, and particularly in the United States. These days, we've revived the Democracy Seminar as a response to the rise of authoritarianism and its threat to democracy in many places, including the United States. We are a worldwide network, a worldwide committee of democratic correspondents. In the past couple of weeks, particularly active with colleagues in Ukraine, Russia, and their neighbors. Today's event is a follow-up on an open letter in defense of democracy authored by Todd Gitlin, Jeffrey C. Isaac, and William Kristol, published on October 27th of last year, simultaneously published in the New Republic and the Bulwark, and signed by many others, including Noam Chomsky and Francis Fukuyama. Claire Potter and I also signed it. Today, we will start by discussing the letter and its implications and consider what the panelists think committed Democrats of the left, right, and center should do now in light of developments since last October. The panelists are a distinguished group with many achievements, books, awards, political accomplishments. I admire each of them, but I will introduce them very briefly so we can hear from them and fully, and not so much from me in presenting the introduction. E.J. Dionne Jr. is a syndicated columnist at the Washington Post, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a university professor at Georgetown University, and a visiting professor at Harvard. He's the author of many books, including Why Americans Hate Politics, which is very dear to me because I think of it as a parallel book to one that I wrote on entitled The Cynical Society, and Why the Right Went Wrong, One Nation After Trump, with a fantastic subtitle, A Guide for the Perplexed, the Disillusioned, the Desperate, and the Not Yet Deported, co-authored with Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann. His latest book with Miles Rappaport is 100% Democracy, the Case for Universal Voting. Jeff Isaac is the James H. Rudy Professor of Political Science at Indiana University in Bloomington, where he has taught many years. He's the author of many books, including most appropriate for today's discussion, the title anyway, Democracy in Dark Times, and a book I published along with Claire Potter, Against Trump. He writes, he's a co-convener of the Democracy Seminar. William Kristol is the founding director of Defending Democracy Together and an editor at large at The Bulwark and a founding editor of Weekly Standard. He's where he edited the magazine for over 2 decades. He before being at The Bulwark, he held many political and governmental appointments connected to the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Claire Potter is a professor of history at the New School for Social Research and co-editor of Public Seminar, a journal, a digital magazine that I founded. Her most recent book is Political Junkies: From Talk Radio to Twitter, How Alternative Media Hooked Us on Politics and Stole Our Democracy. Today, we're going to see whether the tense of her subtitle is corrected. Has it stole our democracy, or is it in the process of stealing our democracy? And what can we do to address the threat? So we're going to discuss the letter and its aftermath, and the questions that we have that I pose will be both interpretive and practical. So the way I'd like to start is by turning to Jeff Isaac, one of the principal authors of the letter, and ask him to give account of how the letter came into being and what the hopes of the authors who wrote the letter were for its impact. Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to everyone. I'll try to be brief so we can have lots of conversation. The letter was a collaboration between myself, Bill Kristol, and Todd Gitlin. Most of the people here probably know that Todd passed away on February 5th. And he was a very close friend of mine. He became very close to me in the years of COVID, but I've known him for many decades, mainly in connection with Dissent magazine. Todd was a true hero of the left ever since the 60s. He was, I believe, the second president of SDS and was very active in the New Left, and then became a very important commentator, historian, and media critic for many, many years, teaching at Berkeley and then teaching at Columbia. And he was really a voice of sanity and reason. His book, The Twilight of Common Dreams, was a really, really important book that was very prescient in many ways. And we miss him greatly. And especially now, his voice is missed, but also him, because he was just a wonderful person. When we originally started thinking about this event, the assumption was that Todd would participate. And obviously he can't, but he's here, I think, in spirit. And certainly his legacy lives on. Very briefly, Todd and I really started communicating very frequently when Trump was elected. And the conversations between us became like furious after the November election. And that's also when Bill and I started communicating regularly, particularly horrified in the days leading up to January 6th. And so I was having these separate conversations with Todd, who I've known for years, and Bill, who I really only got to know in the context of our common aversion to Trumpism. And then I had the idea that the three of us should talk. And I think the first communication that the three of us had was on September 29th, which was of 2021. And we really only worked together for 3 months. It was literally, I think, December 29th when we had a meeting scheduled with Todd and Leo Casey to talk about a project, and Todd just never showed up. And we later learned that he was ill and he passed. But it was really an extraordinary collaboration for the time in which it lasted. And we were very mindful of the fact that Todd and I, in different ways, were on the left, and Bill was a very prominent neoconservative intellectual, someone associated with the right. And we were not really friends before, although I think through our collaboration, we've become friends. But we had a common interest, and it was that common value commitment to liberal democracy, I think, that was the source of our conversations. pretty early into our conversations, it was like, well, what can we do? And we came up with the idea that we could draft this letter, which was so easy to do. It was so seamless, the way in which we crafted the letter together. And then we were like, let's get a bunch of signatures from across the political spectrum. Each of us had certain people we knew, and we were able to get an incredible group of people to come together behind this statement, which I think is still very resonant. So Bill, maybe you want to just say a few more things about that.
Happy to. It's good to be with you all. And I guess I hadn't quite realized the Democracy Seminar had so much of its roots in, Central and East, in the fight for freedom in Central and Eastern Europe in the 80s. And there were so many admirable people in that. And that was in a way the last time, I guess, in America, right? That in a way the Reaganite, the good parts of the Reaganite right and the good parts of the social democratic left were basic. I mean, we disagreed on various tactical things, you might say, in terms of weapons programs, I suppose, but they were really on the same side in terms of the biggest challenge we faced. And I think on the same side in terms of admiring a lot of the same people, whether it was Havel or Valenza or John Paul II, actually, and others there in Central and Eastern Europe. So I do feel like history, in this respect too, history has come back again in a certain way. And now we're, I think, on the same side in respect to Ukraine. And it's the same kind of moment, incidentally, I think, where things are both terrible, really, obviously there, but also hopeful in a certain way, perhaps in terms of the reaction and some of the possibilities that are opened up. And Todd, I do think I didn't know nearly as well as everyone else on this call. EJ wrote a lovely reminiscence, which you should maybe say a word about. But I think Todd really, I mean, my impression is that more and more he cared, that he was very engaged in the Central and Eastern Europe questions, that he knew a ton of people there, he spent time there, he met people, worked with people from there. And so I think he would be, I'm sorry, obviously he's not alive for many reasons, and I'd gotten to know him some, as Jeff said, and admired him over the years. Before I got to know him really well, I'd met him a few times, but he really would have, I think, been very engaged in what's happening in Ukraine, and be very a really wonderful voice, I think, to help frame the road ahead, which is not so easy to see, obviously, in these moments of crisis, but I think is one of which I think a lot of people on the left and right who believe in democracy. I wouldn't even say liberal democracy, so it's not to offend, the people who want to say, I don't know what you want to say, social market, social democracy, or right.
And you might want to say capitalist democracy.
Welfare state democracy. I'll say capitalist democracy. You all can say socialist democracy. Okay, and we can compromise on the modern welfare state, but then we'll be like,
all social
then people will have a heart
Democrats now.
attack because they'll think it's the end of history. So I don't want to even go there. But I do want to say I hope the letter did some good. We actually talked just maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, right, Jeff? Sean Willenson had called me and about doing a follow-up letter on Ukraine. Actually, I think we ended up not doing it partly because, in a way, so much stuff has been said, and good stuff, and people are in the right place. I feel like that we didn't need to really, I didn't think, assemble another people for yet another letter. Maybe there'll be a time to do that. But I'm very pleased to join this conversation and about both the US, but also the world on the authoritarian threat. It's not an accident. The authoritarian threat is global, and some of the causes of it are not just confined to the US. I do think the US, for the fight here is crucial, of course, because it's hard to believe that the prospects for democracy are great if we fail here. And conversely, I think the prospects are pretty decent if we can succeed here and beat back the threat and then build something stronger. We can then just debate exactly what something stronger would be. But I think we all would also agree that needs to happen on the positive side, as well as defeating the threat first.
Are you responsible for Build Back Better, for the slogan, Bill? Have you been talking to Biden?
No, I don't. We don't even need to talk about the various problems of the Democratic Party. And I've got to say, now that I'm on sort of the side of the Democratic Party, sometimes I just think, geez, I don't know, maybe they could be better. They could be a more effective party. I'm just going to put it that way. It's not that I want them to win very badly. I'm sort of more moved by their slight political deficiencies and drawbacks.
So EJ, do you want? Well, actually, why don't I ask Claire to as a co-signer of the letter and as an analyst of American political culture and media culture, to offer her thoughts about this particular letter and such letters. Yes.
I was thinking about the first time I was ever asked to sign anything over the internet, and that was when MoveOn.org was coming together around the Clinton impeachment. And academics were really the first network that MoveOn reached out to. And, that's a pretty long arc of over 20 years. And one of the things that has happened to me over time is I've become more aware of the internet or electronic letter as a media form in and of itself. Organizations like change.org, which is very progressive, really basically use those letters to collect data and collect names that they can resell to other progressive causes. And there are other organizations like that. So my criteria for signing a letter nowadays, and I sign fewer and fewer of them, is that they must be coalitional. Because like other forms of media, these letters seek to divide us. They seek to organize a group of people in opposition to another. And I think the challenges to democracy, which this letter certainly address, have a great deal to do with those forms of division that are reinforced over and over and over again, not just in ordinary political life, but in our daily electronic media life. And that coalitional letters do something that a partisan letter cannot, which is to organize a broad swath of influential people around an abstract issue that is fundamental to keeping our democracy whole and healthy. I would say, other than this letter, the only other letter that I have signed that has gotten more hate mail from my progressive friends is the Harper's letter. And that too was highly coalitional. It was a highly, highly curated group of people. I always believed that a great many progressives were just pissed off because they had not been asked to sign it. So it became a sort of club thing too. But I think it's very important for all of us to be very, very aware of what they sign. Something my mother told me when I went to college, because she, of course, had gone to college during the McCarthy era, where things that you had signed could get you in immense amounts of trouble. I don't worry about the state nowadays. I do worry about lending my name to enterprises that demonize or villainize another group of Americans. Even if those are Americans with whom I have a great many differences, I do like to lend my name to coalitional letters that identify areas of common concern that we can enter, sort of arenas that allow us to have other kinds of conversations. So that's why I signed the letter.
But I agree with you, and I just have to kind of add, I signed it too, that I sign letters with great reluctance, because there's always some sentence or subordinate clause in a letter with which I don't agree. And so, and I'm very, very careful to avoid signing letters where those disagreements, in my judgment, are actually significant. And I don't want to lend, so the act of signing a letter seems to me requires great discernment. And I'm not going to talk about other letters that colleagues of mine have signed recently, but sometimes you sign letters, and I won't be talking about a professor at Harvard. Also, I'm pulling a Nixon about what I'm not going to.
I think you just did.
Yeah, I know. I said I'm pulling a Nixon. I could say, but I won't. But I think we really have to be very careful. But I have one additional question I want to ask of you, Claire, and then we'll turn to EJ. And that is, you explained why you signed such a letter. What about this one? What's behind the signing of this one?
I think a couple of things. One is that it was perfectly clear when the letter went out that whatever happened in the November election, worse was to come. And that in many ways, what we needed to do was develop a coalition of the willing that was prepared to go into action when the worst happened. And I think, for someone like me, I spend a lot of time on alt-right media. It was perfectly clear to me back in October that something terrible was going to happen. People were talking about it quite openly. And unless you're a kind of person who still doesn't believe that MAGA people can pull something off that has never happened before, you had to take it seriously. And so it seemed to me that this coalition of the willing not only needed to make itself visible, but it needed to actually provide a template for others to flock to when in fact the worst thing happened, a set of principles that we could stick by. And if I could just say one more thing, I know we're waiting to hear from EJ. As a feminist, one example of something that I am willing to simply put aside in a diplomatic and pragmatic way is the question of abortion. I disagree with most of my friends on the right about abortion. That being said, I think the abortion issue has been used to divide us on both sides. I think it has been a way of raising money. It has been a way of slicing and dicing us and selling our data. And so as a feminist, actually, I am first a Democrat and second an issues-oriented person. And so this letter met my criteria for that.
Right, yeah. I just want to say a word to address to Bill, just for your information and everyone's. The Democracy Seminar was originally the idea of Adam Michnik in Poland, and I can tell a very dramatic, beautiful story about how it came about, but I won't. I've written about it and could share it with you at some point. But and he recently authored a piece entitled "We Are All Ukrainians," and we are all Ukrainians because we are all Democrats, small d. So it's absolutely parallel to our discussion today. So EJ, what do you make of all this?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's a real honor to be here. And you mentioned Adam Michnik, another great small d Democrat, Ira Katz-Nelson, was very involved in these movements and wrote a wonderful book that was essentially a letter to his friend, Adam Michnik, about areas in which they disagreed, even though they were united about democracy. And it was a really powerful form of political communication because it was a time when friends could disagree while relying on important questions. And that's where we are now. When Jeff was talking about how the Isaac, Kristol, Gitlin alliance came together, Jeff, you reminded me, and maybe you're the only person in this whole call who'll remember this, you reminded me of Al Cooper and Mike Bloomfield describing how an old group called Super Session came together. It was one of the first coalition groups of rock stars. And that was an extraordinary moment for music. This was an extraordinary moment for politics. I think that and just to say a word about Todd, and thank you, Bill, that was kind of you. I love Todd, and I'd been on the phone with him about 2 weeks before he died, and he was still full of plans. There was nothing, he had never stopped this. What happened, his death came as a shock to all of us because he was still full of physical and intellectual energy at the moment he died. I think the most important thing about Todd is actually what unites us on this call, which is he was always a small d Democrat. When you think about the time he was president of SDS, that was in the early days of SDS when the idea of participatory democracy and what the Port Huron statement had to say about democracy was at the heart of the New Left. And Todd never lost that. And when the New Left veered in peculiar directions from Maoism in some sectors to with the Weathermen and others, Todd never lost his way as a small d Democrat. And he also, and our friend Eric Alterman wrote about this powerfully, he never lost the capacity to listen to what other people were saying and responding to them. And sometimes he'd respond argumentatively, but it was an argumentativeness that came from respect and from real listening. I think this coalition, if you will, reflects something that happens at various moments when democracy and freedom become dividing lines. I think you saw this, for example, in the late 30s and early 40s on the right between certain isolationists, who some of whom, not all of whom, certainly had some sympathies for Hitler and Mussolini, but really had kind of run out of faith in democracy and its capacity to solve problems. You saw it on the left with Stalin and attitudes towards Stalin, particularly after the invasion of Hungary, after the Soviets put down the Hungarian Revolution, and then again after they put down the revolt in Czechoslovakia. And then you saw it on the right in the McCarthy period. There are these moments where people who care about democracy, freedom, tolerance, openness, find themselves splitting from their own side. And it's one of the reasons I've admired what Bill has done so much from the very beginning. As Bill and I go back a long way, I always knew he'd end up on the right side. I never lost faith in that. It just took a while, but it took, but Donald Trump did it. And he did it for a lot of people. And to Claire's point about the need for people to converse across lines, I always joke that I'm so old and have been around Washington so long that I have a lot of conservative friends. But one of the things that happened in my experience is almost all of my conservative friends became anti-Trumpers, which suggested, oddly, a reason why we could disagree on many matters and still be friends, because in almost every case, in fact, every case I can think of, for each of them, a commitment to democracy and decency ended up mattering more than their Republican partisanship or even than conservative politics. They weren't willing to trade everything for judges and tax cuts, as some Republicans have been sadly willing to do. And I think that's why this letter was so important, because it was in significant part a commentary on the Republican Party. And I say that as someone, I always say my dirty little secret in life is that I was a teenage liberal Republican. And that's a dirty little secret because the most boring thing you could possibly be as a teenager is a liberal Republican. And I realized very quickly that didn't work. And I moved toward the left, the Democratic left. But I think that there are many of us looked at Republicans and said, boy, we're mad at them about this. I could argue with Bill about Florida and 2000, as we did a lot back then. I still think some of the roots of what happened on January 6th are in that fight, but we won't go there in the interest of coalition politics. But I was always convinced they were Democrats. And so now comes the Ukraine moment. And I'll close on this. I think if there was anyone who lacked clarity before this, they really ought to have clarity now. And I had yesterday, I happened to have lunch with 4 Social Democratic members of the German Bundestag. And it was a very moving experience. It was also very informative because they were all talking about how much of a sudden break Ukraine represented among the Social Democrats. The fact that the party of Ostpolitik, and of course, the German Social Democrats always felt that the fall of communism owed a lot, they believed, to Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik strategy. For the party of Ostpolitik, within a week, and really within a 4-day period, I think somebody will write a book someday called 4 Days in Germany, within a 4-day period to say, Russia has shown itself, Putin in particular, let's focus on Putin. Putin has shown himself in an unmistakable way to be who he is. Many did not believe he would actually do what he did in Ukraine. And once he did, it required a new posture. And I think the heartening thing that's happened out of this awful catastrophe, is that throughout the democratic world, and not just the Western democratic world, there is a realization that democracy really is at the center of this fight, and it's something we all need to understand.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Okay, I want to basically offer a slightly more jaundiced view of things. As
We've had that relationship, Jeff, for a long time.
well, there's no one who's more upbeat about life, and also the books of their friends than you, EJ. So thank you for that. We need you. We drafted that letter in part to amplify the argument that some form of voting legislation ought to be passed by Congress, which is an explicit part of the letter. And we never imagined that that letter would cause it to take place, but we wanted to amplify the idea. And it didn't happen, okay? And, you know, I don't want to say the letter was a failure, but the fact is, and I reread the letter before, every single thing that it says about US politics, I would argue is still true, even though it is also true that Ukraine has kind of cast things in a different light. And in particular, lots of the people who, let's say, are, I don't want to use the term enemies even in connection with this, with politics at all, but like the anti-democrats that we are declaring our opposition to in the letter, many of them have now subtly or reluctantly come along and said, we support democracy too, we support Ukraine, whatever. And the general political situation has been complicated by that. But I would argue most of those people are still anti-democrats in the way they were when we drafted the letter. And that has to do with most of the Republican leaders, not all, and also has to do with people like Viktor Orban. And, you know, it's true that the Polish Peace and Justice government and Orban's government are now behind NATO. But that doesn't mean that the threat that they pose to democracy has ended, even though obviously at this moment they're doing something good. So the situation is much more complicated, but the underlying challenges of democracy are as grave, I would argue. And, you know, I just want to say also, Bill and I talk about this a lot. EJ writes about this a lot, but like the chances are the Republicans are going to retake control of Congress in a few months. And given the way that party is organized, that's a really dangerous thing. Anyway.
Could I
Okay,
jump in
so
just
wait,
30
wait,
seconds, because I want to hear Bill and Claire on this, but I just want to
Okay,
reply.
so you say something quickly, and then Claire wants to speak, and then
Yeah.
I'll add.
I just want to acknowledge what Jeff said. It's somebody very dear to me once accused me of toxic positivity. It's a new concept that I have taken on, and I share your profound disappointment that nothing happened on voting rights. And I think it is something, it still angers me, it still worries me. And you're quite right. And I want to hear Bill and Claire and Bill on this. So yes, I do not want to pretend that Ukraine has instantly transformed everyone into a perfect small d Democrat who will go in tomorrow morning and pass the Freedom to Vote Act. I wish that were true. I do still think that the stakes have been clarified, and that even if it's not always in good faith, the fact that so many Republicans, where was Mike Pence 2 years ago? He now said there's no room for apologists for Putin. There was room for apologists for Putin for a long time, but
in the White House.
But the fact that there is the bad conscience there now is at least itself a good sign.
Okay, Claire.
So one of the things I'm thinking about, to sort of return to the letter as a touchstone, is it talks about voting rights, which we all care deeply about. We know it failed, but voting rights is actually not the same thing as it was in 1965. And the information environment has changed dramatically. That changes what it means to vote. And I think, you know, when we think about how the situation in Ukraine is able to reflect back to us certain kinds of things that we need to return to in our political life, one of them is that the information environment produces voting in the first place in a way it didn't in 1965. Yes, it did in some ways, but in other ways, there was not this sort of massive cascade of asks coming at people, of information, of emails that say, Claire, the GOP is coming for your uterus, or worse, Claire, Mitch McConnell wants your freedom of speech, or, something like that. So I think when we talk about voting, we need to return to some questions that nobody seems to be able to answer. Like, why do poor people in West Virginia keep electing Joe Manchin? It's not because they don't have the right to vote. It's not because so many people have been excluded from voting in West Virginia. So that to the extent that we think about democracy as a kind of conversation, the conversation has been hijacked by a political consulting industry that is completely and totally unregulated. So to come back to voting rights, here's where I think Republicans do a better job than Democrats. Republicans are much more flexible in their approach to issues. Something's not working, they try something else. They try another way in. Everything that's happening on school boards now across the United States, which is completely and totally undemocratic, is being driven by one PAC, the 1776 PAC, that is throwing $2,000 or $3,000 into school board races, and that's all you need to win them. So I think one of the things that we might want to think about is, how did Ukrainians actually survive the same information environment that everybody else is in, and the external dangers that they were being bombarded with this keen and clear sense of what democracy means to them and what they're willing to do to fight for it. And I don't think Americans have that yet.
Okay, thank you. I just want to kind of speak to the audience for a moment, and that is, we're having an ongoing conversation, but I invite people in the audience to pose their questions. One question has already been posed, and the question that has been posed by David Keppel refers to the issue of whether the struggle in Ukraine thwarts the Democratic left's attempt to cut the Pentagon budget. And David's question kind of reminds me about our collaboration dilemmas. We want, and by the way, the Democracy Seminar had a special session on the question of collaboration, both the positive and negative meaning of collaboration. I think that all the people, the discussants here, all the panelists here, can agree to the grounds upon which we can collaborate, the grounds upon which the issues about which we respectfully disagree, and our commitment that our disagreements will be decided through democratic process. So that's free and easy. But Jeff has friends, and I and Claire and EJ, it's a stacked deck, I guess, on the left, who think that the kinds of discussions we're having now here are acts of collaboration in the negative sense, that we're actually breaking up the possibility of a concerted, progressive force for transformation. Thus, David's question reveals that problem. There are all different kinds of collaborations. Who do we collaborate with in this project of opposing democracy? How? And now is the question I have for the panelists, and I also have for myself. Does anyone, do I need to talk more about that? Okay, Bill.
Maybe I could say a word just to pick up on something Claire said, and something actually the Jeff, EJ, optimism, pessimism issue. I think Claire's point is very good, but maybe it's not an accident that the Democratic leader of Ukraine has been so effective is a 44-year-old who is, made it from most of his professional career, was very familiar with, let's say, modern communications, ranging from social media, obviously, the internet. And obviously, that's an interesting lesson maybe for us. It would be great to have, without going overboard, I don't know all the details about Zelensky and all, but, it'd be great to have our own version of that. And he is not, sitting around lamenting the decline of the old gatekeepers, but rather using modern methods to make the case for himself. And also, we probably could do more of that to the Russian people and so forth. But I think it's a very good point about I got about literally must have got in the last, I don't know, 3, 4, well, last week, Trump went with that ridiculous new platform he has, Truth, I think it's called. And I've gotten, I don't know, a dozen texts, from him, urgently telling me I have to subscribe, join, I guess it is. And I sort of, first of all, I don't get that many texts, from campaigns. That's mostly email problem. But secondly, why am I on Trump's list? I mean, I haven't given money to a Republican since pathetic efforts to stop Trump in early 2016, when I gave money sequentially to Rubio and Kasich, and I think Carly Fiorina first, maybe. So I don't even know what lists they're buying, but there you go. And but it is astonishing how many of them there are. So, and it is totally unregulated, right? I mean, the degree to which it's just lies and fraud and grift. I mean, you think the lies are hard to regulate in a First Amendment country. The actual grift, I mean, the actual just pretend you're going to get this and then you're not going to get this, is kind of astonishing that people get away with that. On the point about the voting, just on the voting rights particular, and then we can get on to the broader question Jeff raised. I do think look, the Republicans are responsible for stopping it, period. There's no question about that. They had 49 or 50 Republicans against it, and there was no interest in negotiating or give on either the Freedom to Vote Act, the broader act, or the John Lewis correction of the voting rights, or restoring, let's say, of the Voting Rights Act. So I want to make clear it's the Republicans' responsibility. Having said that, you could argue that, and I was on many of these calls with coalition groups, and we did some work on it. Our Defending Democracy Together, Republicans for Voting Rights. Democrats probably made some tactical mistakes, and maybe could have made a little difference with a slightly different strategy. But for me, the indication of this was last week in the state. The indication of sort of the problem of getting serious about what has to be done was in President Biden's State of the Union last week, parts of which I thought were good, and overall I'm sympathetic to, but where he, I think out of loyalty to the groups that had worked so hard on these bills, mentioned actually all 3 bills, which are not going anywhere this year. I think the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Act, and the Disclose Act, which is a sort of different kind of campaign finance reform, more type legislation, and sort of made some pro forma plea for them, and did not mention the Electoral Account Act, which actually, I've actually done a lot of work on this, which is not going to solve every problem, believe me, but will help strengthen some of the safeguards against what Trump tried to do only a year ago. It's kind of hard to believe, right? We've all moved on, but except it was literally, 15 months ago that he was trying to subvert the election. And the November 3rd to January 6th period turned out to be particularly difficult or subject to abuse, because we had all taken for granted that people would act more or less in good faith, and therefore the closest we came, as EJ mentioned, was Bush v. Gore, but that was resolved by the Supreme Court. I mean, but the kind of incredible attempts to overturn the election within the executive branch and through state legislatures, and then through Congress and through mob action, we hadn't seen that. So that the Electoral Account Act would not solve everything. And I keep telling people working on it, don't let the best be the enemy of the good. You can always come up with some scheme that it can't deal with, of some bad faith thing. But there are lots of things that it will do that help. And it's not even very hard. I mean, there's quite a lot of consensus about what has to be done. And very well-known conservative law professors and former judges are on board this, along with most, I think almost all liberal kind of law professors, in terms of some of the fixes. And Biden didn't mention it. Now, maybe that was maybe it didn't need to, maybe that was a tactical thing. He doesn't want to make it look like a Biden administration issue, but it's a little bit, for me, a signal of the sort of lack of focus almost on, can we get the safeguards of democracy strengthened first before we got into the normal laundry list of proposals, all of which are up there anyway, and they don't really need much. Biden he can endorse them all he wants in the State of the Union. They're either going to get the votes or they're not, and the interest groups are going to weigh in or they're not. There's a lack of focus all across the spectrum on the urgency of the democracy issue, I guess. And I think that's one reason we did the letter, not that we were telling anyone anything they didn't know, but trying to get this issue, the letter was drafted in the middle of all the building back, now I'm blanking on the name of it, after the BBB stuff and the legislation and Manchin. It was like, oh, look, that's complicated. Well, it's not complicated anyway. It's either going to make it or it's not going to make it. And we don't have much advice to give Nancy Pelosi on how to manage these things, or to give presumably the Biden White House, or maybe we do, but whatever. And but could we just remember that this kind of matters an awful lot. And so for me, it was less the details of some of the voting bills, some of which I wasn't crazy about, and more, we had an election in 2020, which we did was, in a way, it was a great tribute to the country. Incredible turnout, incredibly clean election, incidentally, and the highest turnout ever in modern times, basically. And we did it sort of on the run in the middle of a pandemic, with an awful lot of people acting in a pretty impressive way at the state and local level, in good faith, I would say, to try to get people, make sure people could get to vote, and changing some of the regulations in terms of absentee voting and obviously mail voting and stuff. So that was both a success of American democracy at the state, local, and civil society level, you might say. And then we have a pretty concerted Republican effort to reverse that at the state legislative level, and Trump promoting the big lie in a way that's really dangerous going forward, more dangerous, I would say, for 2023, 2024, even then immediately. And that's kind of number 6 on people's lists of things they should be worried about. And it just felt, that's one reason I think we did the letter, was sort of, hey, not to say you shouldn't care a lot about all kinds of other issues, infrastructure and stuff, but could we focus on this a little? So I am worried that and this gets in the way therefore indirectly, and I'll close this to Jeff's question on the coalitional side. If you don't think the threat to democracy is really urgent, really serious, really fundamental, well, then of course you're going to say, why should we, be making common cause with people like me who do want to increase actually the defense budget some in light of what's happening, and they're all for all kinds of other policies, I suppose, that some people don't like. And why do we need to prioritize, in a sense, this effort? But if you think the fight is fundamental, and I think it's pretty hard to deny it is at this point, personally, I think people shouldn't give up on anything, and they should fight their fights for the defense budget on the floor of Congress and so forth, and fight within the Biden administration. But I think, I guess I just come back to the urgency of the democracy question, the centrality of it. And I do think if we can deal with this adequately, honestly, I say this to my friends on the left, they will be much better positioned to make progress on a lot of other issues. I mean, breaking the kind of, it's not an accident that the kind of gridlock we had led to what we're now dealing with. And if what we're now dealing with can be dealt with, I think in kind of reverse almost, the gridlock will be broken. That was certainly the case, incidentally, with the last, huge threats to democracy, right? An awful lot of progress was made on a lot of traditional progressive issues from 1945, let's just say, to 1970, after democracy had been, the greatest threats had been pushed back, either defeated or checked in the case of the Soviet Union. And I don't think that's entirely an accident, if you're, that the civil rights movement happened in the wake of World War II and so forth, and in the midst of the rhetoric of the Cold War. So I'm not saying that everything progressives want will happen if we defeat Trump, but I actually think just analytically, they're a heck of a lot better off with that victory, in partial victory, it's not going to be a full one, in hand, or some recouping of the damage that's been done, and some path ahead, as opposed to sort of pretending this isn't an urgent matter. So,
Can I jump in very quickly? David, who asked the original question, David Capel, is a friend of mine from Bloomington, and a very long-term, serious public intellectual for peace and peace activist. And I haven't talked to him about Ukraine. I don't know what his view about Ukraine is, but it is worth pointing out that there are some people who signed our letter, most notably Chomsky, who would not agree with the reading of Ukraine that I think is the premise of our conversation. And that's a legitimate disagreement. And, I think a lot of peace activists will regard the whole Ukrainian situation as being like the fault of NATO, and will also regard arguments for arming Ukrainians as kind of, bellicose and militaristic. I get that. I suspect that it's possible that David might be in that category. I don't want to speak for him. His question was a really good one. But for me, it's not only that I want to continue working with Bill on the defense of democracy in a broad sense in this country. I'm not in favor of huge increases in the Pentagon's budget, but right now it is important to support the Ukrainian military, in my opinion. And while a lot of us on the left don't like military things are also important. And this situation, for some of us, I will speak only for myself, accentuates the reasons why it's important to have NATO and why it is important to have a military budget. And peace, Putin needs to be defeated. I'm not saying there needs to be a war against him, but that, for some of us, that's an important imperative that involves at least a strong military dimension.
So this conversation is just bursting with potential in all different directions. Very, very exciting. And I'm going to try to make it so that we cover the different paths we could take adequately. There is the question that Michael Burgess asks about the connection. How does Putin's war concretely impact Trumpism? That should be in the background of our conversation. Then Simon Luo asks, what's the relationship between letters such as this one that we signed, and all of us but EJ observed with great
I'm an old-fashioned journalist, so I don't tend to sign letters, but
that's right.
I was deeply sympathetic to my friends on this.
We were hoping EJ would write a column on the letter.
Yeah. We sign such letters, but what effect, we're a privileged cultural elite. We're part of a privileged cultural elite. What's the relationship between our coming together and politics on the ground? Why sign such letters? And particularly, how do you think such letters can affect these possible floating coalitions? So I think that there are coalitions on the left that Jeff and I and Claire may want to work on to kind of convince our friends who are very pro, anti-imperialist, that actually coming together, anti-capitalist, coming together on the issue of democracy has to take priority, and we have to actually work with Bill, and then we have to convince Bill and his friends that even though some of our friends are really not to his liking, that he has to join with them in this project. And it's not easy to do that. And especially when you consider what we intellectuals can do, and who think about such things as a matter of our very existence, and what people who are just trying to make sense of their lives and get on and be good citizens, but don't focus particularly on that. And I think, by the way, that dimension is one of the reasons why democracy can be so dear to us, be the priority issue. And I completely agree with Bill on that. But can we really expect that of ordinary other types of people? So EJ and then Claire.
Yeah, there's so much been put on the table. I think your question now goes to your original question.
Yes.
About coalition politics. And just an aside, I think intellectuals, left intellectuals, love the thinking of Antonio Gramsci, because Gramsci argues that intellectuals really matter because they help change the underlying moral basis of politics. But I don't think Gramsci was wrong about that. And I actually have said for a long time that some of my conservative friends seem to have read Gramsci more closely at times than the left had. Look at the movement that Bill's dad started among neoconservatives. They were not a mass movement, but they created change. And I think of Bill and his friends as the reverse of that anti-Trump conservatives are people who are fed up with a certain style of conservatism. And so that's why Bill is retracing those steps. Coalition politics is called coalition politics for a reason. Coalitions involve people who disagree on things. They are discrete groups of people who don't have exactly the same mix of views, but for the purpose of their coalition, decide that at a particular moment, certain issues matter more than others, and that they will join together despite those other disagreements. I think at this moment, democracy, the threat to democracy from not only the Trumpist right, not only the Putin right, but also the authoritarian right across Europe. People like Le Pen and Zemmour in France, like the AfD in Germany, and like a couple of right-wing parties in Italy. That this is a moment when it is very important to push back against a right-wing authoritarianism that really threatens democracy. And if small d Democratic conservatives are ready to join that fight, the last thing we want to do is push them away, because on that core question, which matters, we are together. Just two other quick points, a small one on the Electoral Account Act. I think Biden, there are many of us who look at the Electoral Account Act and worry that it becomes an excuse not to have passed a more fundamental Voting Rights Act. I think Biden did not want to send the signal that it was adequate. I also think he didn't want to mess up negotiations, nonpartisan negotiations. I think what you're going to see is an effort to make the reform of the Electoral Account Act stronger than just that. For example, at least Jim Wallace, my friend, has proposed this, at least say that the Electoral Account Act will also outlaw states pushing aside the nonpartisan counting of ballots. That ought to be a bare minimum of any kind of electoral reform. Last point on Putinism and Trumpism that was asked. I think it's very striking that in Europe, Le Pen, for example, had to pulp 1.2 million leaflets that had her picture with Putin on it. And the party said, oh, we got to throw these away. Orban in Hungary has had to pull back from, there was a good piece in the Financial Times this morning from Putin. This is having an effect on the far right. And again, we're seeing in the Republican Party that Putin love is not fashionable all of a sudden. So I do think that this moment is leading to second thoughts, even if they're only tactical. They are concessions by people who once held a certain view. We can't be satisfied with that. We got to continue to fight these movements. But something is in the air, I think, that's worth noting.
Claire, I think I noted that you wanted to say something now, yeah?
Yeah, just quickly, sort of going back to a small comment you made, Jeff, about Bill's friends and our friends. Many of Bill's friends are my friends. And, you know, I grew up in Southern Idaho. Everybody I knew but my grandparents was a Goldwater Republican. And I went to college with Robert Kagan, and we read the New York Times together every day over breakfast. And I think, you know, part of what has happened is with the decline of social space and the elevation of difference as a way of interacting with each other, we've really neglected broader spaces where people can have these kind of ordinary interactions and discuss things with each other, not to win or lose, but to actually refine what actually needs to be done in a democracy. And so I think one of the functions a letter like this plays is that it creates that potential space around which a conversation can happen, but it also makes visible people who indeed are friends, people who have genuine and mutual commitments to democracy and are willing to act on them and do not fear the social stigma from their primary constituent group from doing that. And I think the last thing I would say is the biggest threat to democracy in the United States is nationalist populism. And that is because it is taking down the Republican Party. If we do not have a functioning and vital Republican Party, we do not have a vital and functioning policy apparatus. And that is, in fact, why Washington is broken as a place to make policy, is that, in fact, the Republican Party has disabled itself as a policy-making apparatus.
So now I
And Claire
really
brilliantly
I'd
brought us
like to
right
hear
back
what
to
Bill
the
has to
letter,
say.
by the way.
Yeah, there's
Bill, I'm really curious what you have to say about Claire's last declaration about the Republican Party. Is it beyond repair, or do we have? Is there reason to believe that it can play the necessary function that it has played in the past for a democracy.
I think it's beyond salvation in the short term,
Yeah.
probably, but I very much agree with Claire's point, and I've been trying to make this point for years. I mean, that look, you can write a scenario, and I didn't think this was likely. That's why I was so anti-Trump, but I thought it was possible. Trump becomes president, the party keeps him under, the congressional party distances itself from him and basically keeps him at arm's length and doesn't simply fall into line. The establishment with Republicans within his own administration, some of this happened, of course, keep him also at, as it were, arm's length and constrain him. The guardrails therefore sort of hold. You still have 4 years of a very bad president and a dangerous president and a demagogic populist and nationalist and bigot and so forth. But, you can imagine a scenario where the guardrails are hold or are propped up. These guardrails don't have their own agency, so they need humans to actually make them work.
Right.
Are propped up within the administration, on the Hill, and of course in civil society. That part I think worked better actually, and at the state and local level and the media and so forth, and we kind of get through it. It's not a fair comparison probably, but Berlusconi maybe, I don't know that much about Italian politics, but demagogue to become president and be president and do some damage. And you can imagine that it doesn't fundamentally challenge the basics of our liberal democratic system and the rule of law and decency in politics and so forth. It's sort of like, you have Jesse Ventura as governor of Minnesota for 4 years. Again, it's a little unfair to Jesse Ventura, who I think believes in democracy probably, but you can have a flaky president, I guess. And it's flukish. He wins the primary, 15 different candidates. He wins the general, a kind of lucky electoral college break, and Russians help him, and a weak Democratic candidate, I suppose. And so that's kind of one scenario. That's what I think the decent Republicans who didn't go where I went in 2017 is what that's what they had in mind. And it wasn't crazy. I mean, maybe it was turned out to be wrong, but it wasn't crazy. That didn't happen. So I totally agree with Claire. The key thing that happened was the Republican Party became Trump's party. If you have a president, that's bad. If you have a president who controls one of the two major parties in America in a 50-50 divided country, you're in a whole different level of danger to democracy, to decency, to civility in the country. That's how hyperpartisanship becomes real social polarization, real, what do they call it, affective polarization. It starts to spread throughout the country because it is down to the school board level, and it's not one guy sitting in Washington popping off and everyone else at the state and local level is going about his or her business in a mostly normal way with a little bit of distortion because of your president. As I say, I think that, so I very much agree that the takeover or complicity or acquiescence or enabling of the Republican Party has been the crucial story. We've all had, one reason my friends and I sort of stayed in the party and tried to fight within the party. I voted for Democrats, but claimed to want to fight within the party, I tried to, through about 2019, was I did think it just objectively very dangerous to have one of the two major parties be anti-democratic. And if you can avoid that, even if you have to swallow hard about some of the people you're going to be working with, and even if you have to, whatever, it's probably worth it. At some point, I decided, and I would say this is true of most of my friends, that it's not only that in the short term do we have to vote Democratic, but that the prospects were so grim that the best thing is to defeat the Republican Party pretty outright, as much as one can, as opposed to hoping that every time the little green shoot shows up that it's going to be going to be a change in the party. And I mean, January 6th is the dispositive thing. January 7th, it still wasn't crazy to think, okay, maybe that's it. The fever might have broken. And you could imagine people very belatedly and somewhat, irresponsibly and somewhat getting away with stuff they shouldn't get away with still coming around, sort of like the Stalinists who decided in 1974 or something that, wow, that was really kind of a bad, regime there in the Soviet Union, or obviously on the right, the equivalent. But, they really never knew about the Gulag until they, were in Paris and Solzhenitsyn's book was translated to French or whatever. But still, you have to accept the allies you can. But that's, for me, the January 6th was, there's the subsequent history of January 6th is dispositive in meaning the party can't be saved. Now, Liz Cheney, who I very much disagreed with over the course of Trump's presidency, and I'd known her pretty well, and we drifted apart really for this reason. But she went along more than I thought wise or prudent or decent. Well, decent's not fair, but certainly than was desirable. She sort of had the view that after 4 years, the fever could break, he's going to lose in November, and we can get back to something semi-normal. And I think one reason she's been so fierce as a critic is that she turned out to be wrong. She internalized that and really thought through the implications of what she had learned. And that's why she's been so clear in saying, we cannot have him again as the nominee. We cannot have him again as president. And she even says, I won't support Kevin McCarthy as speaker because he is part of the enabling of Trump to be dominant in the party and therefore the nominee, and therefore maybe 50-50, 40-60, whatever chance of becoming the next president. So I think but it's what's amazing is how so few people have gotten down that path. And even the people who are now distancing themselves a little, I mean, Charlie Sykes and I and friends have been sort of debating this, and some of it's been some sort of public even. How much do you welcome them? It's nice. It's probably good to weaken Trump some, and good for Pence to say what he said, and Bill Barr to say the guys, wouldn't listen to reason. But then there's same people, Chris Christie, are all like, but of course I would vote for the Republican nominee in 2024. And my instinct is to say, well, forget it then. I mean, if you still would vote for him, you haven't really learned anything, and you're not really contributing much. But then friends of mine will say, not stupidly, well, I don't know, if it chips away, and they don't quite say what you want them to say, but it's still better that they're saying that than the opposite. And there's some truth to that too. So I guess I'd say the coalitional thing is one side of it, but the figuring out, and this was a big, huge problem in Central and Eastern Europe, obviously, after 89 and before 89 to some degree, right? Figuring out how much you accommodate a lot of people who aren't saying what you think they really need to say, but are sort of directionally weakening the worst of the worst and maybe helping a little bit and not going along with everything, has some, virtues too. And I think these are genuinely difficult judgment calls in some cases. And I mean, I don't think where to go is a difficult judgment call, but I mean, how to handle some of these tactical questions is a difficult judgment call. But just to get back to the fundamental point, I very much agree. We have a Trump problem, we have a Trumpism problem, but both of those problems would be Joe McCarthy problems, if you want to think of it this way. Bad, dominates a party sort of for 2-3 years, does some damage, but ultimately doesn't fund. American politics goes ahead in the late 50s and 60s and 70s, and I think you can say there's strains of McCarthyism that exist, and that's unfortunate, but it doesn't shape American politics. It doesn't shape the Eisenhower administration or the Republican Party that much in the 60s and 70s. Well, really for the next decades, I would say. And so that's a manageable problem, very bad, but manageable. When they dominate the party and continue to dominate the party, continue to dominate after January 6th, you're at a whole different level of that's the way to think about it, I think, that you sort of have a party that's dominated by Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism for conceivably decades. And what does that do to our politics?
I'd like to just agree with Phil, but also disagree with him, or at least differ, not disagree, differ. And I think the spirit of this, first the difference, then the agreement. The difference is, it is absolutely true. This conversation is about coalitions for democracy, and coalitions for democracy, which we support, the people here, are also coalitions of coalitions. Bill is really wrestling with a real question. And, Charlie Sykes wrote about this. He referenced it in the Bulwark, a never again Trump coalition, gag reflex warning. And it's a real problem for them, like to what extent they want to deal with Republicans that make them sick now. It's not a problem for me. Like, I'm much more sickened than they are, because I never knew them as anything but people who made me sick. And so, like, our coalition, different elements of that coalition are going to legitimately, position themselves differently. That's the nature of a coalition. Like, Bill is definitely my friend, but some of the people who are his friends are not my friends. They're not necessarily my enemies, but that's an enormously complicated thing. And I think we need to recognize that and also respect it. Like, I'm not going to turn my back on Bill if he talks to Bill Barr. Like, I don't want to talk to Bill Barr, but Bill may need to talk to Bill Barr. Bill runs an organization, Republicans for Democracy. I'm not part of that. Okay, so there's that. That's just a healthy difference that I think makes this unity special and valuable. The commonality is, let me just say, Bill did not surprise me at all with his answer. He believes the Republican Party needs to be fundamentally defeated for now. And that means that we're in real trouble, because they're probably not going to be defeated in November. And I think that just accentuates the urgency of this moment for us all.
Could I just say, I so admire, as I said earlier, people like Bill and his allies who have been willing to say this Republican Party is defective and bad for democracy. And that took a lot of courage. Breaking with your friends is a lot easier than trashing your enemies. Having said that,
well,
I
The
harder.
other way around. The other
What?
way around.
It's
I'm
harder
sorry?
than trashing
I
your
mean,
enemies.
it's a lot harder.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Than trashing your enemies. Bless you. Having said that, I think within this coalition for democracy, there are real arguments to be had. I would argue, my friends Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein argued, that the trajectory of conservatism toward Trumpism began long before Trump, and that our conservative friends, we believe, need to take account of that. And we would argue back to them that, thank God you're where you are today, much as Bill said about Liz Cheney, who came to this later than he did, that we would ask our conservative friends to say, look, there were these seeds of McCarthyism that went straight through to the Birch Society and forward. You can argue that there were elements in the Gingrich Revolution that helped lead to some of this. Look where Newt himself, sadly, has ended up. And so I think within this alliance for democracy, we can have real arguments with our friends about what went wrong and why those of us who hold a certain perspective hold it as opposed to their perspective. But that on core questions that are urgent and have reached a crisis point, we're going to work together. And we're going to have these arguments even as we work together.
I mean, just two very super quick points. I mean, I agree with that. Look, I've rethought things. Charlie Sykes has written a book about this, rethinking things. Stuart Stevens said it was all a lie. I don't quite agree with that, but some of it was, there were aspects of it that were very bad that we didn't realize how bad they were. There were aspects we thought, I mean, Pat Buchanan and stuff. I know, I'm happy to help drive him out of the Republican Party, but other aspects we turned a blind eye to. I totally accept all that. And that's, one could then argue about the particulars of which were the worst and how much these recessive genes are just going to be there in life because Charlie Sykes called it the recessive gene was there. We didn't want to see it. Now, it was recessive mostly, and then we could argue about how mostly or partly. And, that's always going to be there, sort of, because it's a huge country and there's 60 million people voting for the Republican Party. So, but I take that point. I think it's a very fair point. I do think there's been a fair amount of rethinking, not all of it in public and not all of it breastfeeding, because who wants to do that? But, honest rethinking on a bunch of issues for me, I'd say, especially, for example, on race and police and some of these things where it's just evident that I was wrong, I think, about what I thought about the reality of things 7, 8 years ago. It is funny, this moment, though, funny, but I do find there are a lot of things I think other people should do that I personally cannot go into a room with most of these Republicans. I just don't want to be with these Republican senators. I don't think I could keep my composure and be a very good negotiator or interlocutor with them. There are Democratic senators who are much to the left of me who, of course, do have to deal with them. And I remember laughing with one of them about one of the very few I still speak to on the Republic, not with the Democrats, it's one of the new ones I still speak to on the Democratic side. He's more open to meeting with these people that I just can't really even stomach, as they voted. They knew better. They couldn't vote for not just the first, but even the second impeachment. And look, Joe Biden is in this position. Joe Biden is much nicer to Mitch McConnell than I am, and I don't begrudge him that. He's got to do what he's got to do to try to get legislation passed, and the Electoral Account Act has had a little bit of this on the private negotiations on that and so forth. So, I mean, how we end up, different people have different roles. Jeff mentioned public intellectuals, or intellectuals have one role. They can be a little more strict, you might say, and astringent. Politicians have a different role. Some of us are sort of in between those worlds. We all are to some degree, since we're having this conversation. And I do think just being understanding that, different people have to do different things and support, but there have to be some red lines also, right? You do need, I agree, you can't just sort of be so fluid that it's all kind of welcoming every single person and pretending history didn't happen. But this is a concrete thing that people have, for decades and centuries, have dealt with in politics, and it isn't easy.
Claire.
So one of the reasons I wrote my book, Political Junkies, was I wanted a large audience to understand what Republicans and Democrats had done together to bring us to the 2016 election. And I think that sort of brings me to maybe to supplement what EJ was saying. I think Democrats need to look at the history of the Republican Party and see what they did right. And I'm always going back to that 1964 moment, which I think was a huge turning point. But Phyllis Schlafly's book, A Choice, Not an Echo, which she makes a marketing decision not to put it in bookstores because she doesn't trust bookstores run by liberal readers to sell them. And instead, she creates a network with this book. Most people got A Choice, Not an Echo from a friend. Okay. And I always think of that moment when Phyllis Schlafly walked into the 1964 convention and all of these delegates, all these Goldwater delegates are walking around with a copy of her book. It's one of the greatest political successes of all time. And I think what Democrats don't understand, and even, post-Trump, there is very little attempt to connect Democrats to each other, to activate networks of friends, to really go into communities. I was working on the Danielle Allen campaign in Massachusetts, and they had all this data-driven stuff, all of these texting we were supposed to do, phone calls and so on. Fact is, nobody in Western Massachusetts knew who Danielle Allen was, and if we actually had political strategies that were drawn on successful Republican strategies, and Phyllis Schlafly played the long game, she came out for Trump, her family tried to institutionalize her, and then she cast her absentee ballot and died before he was elected. I mean, it's actually a perfect story. Democrats are unwilling to actually take a look at the kind of energy that Republicans have generated, understand it as sincere, and say, how did they do that? And what is it that we need to do that is not driven by smartphones and computers and databases that could actually generate that kind of connection and energy for our party?
Why do you think
I
that
so
happened?
agree
I mean,
with
the anti-war
Claire
movement.
I just want to say, I so agree with Claire that I have Phyllis Schlafly's book nearby, published by Père Marquette Press. And there is something so interesting about how she did what she did. I couldn't agree more.
I mean,
Wait a second. This seems like a setup.
Yeah, that
Is
was
that
a
the
setup.
book right
Claire
there?
and EJ were on the chat function with the rest of us,
It's right there on my shelf.
excluded. But what about? I mean, the left has done this well over decades, I would say. I mean, left is too narrow for the civil rights movement, obviously. But whether it's anti-war or environmentalism in the early years, feminism in certain ways, I don't know. It's not as if it is kind of an interesting question. Why is the right better at what are traditionally, I think, has been better in the last 20, 30, 40 years, maybe cynically better, of course, and maybe with big money behind it, but at a kind of, I don't know, participatory is not really the right word. What's the word? But, bottom up, let's just say, strategy, which is supposed to be, of course, what the left is supposed to be for. And the right has traditionally been slightly, well, I guess it hasn't been disdainful. The more fascistic right has always, of course, been interested in that too, right? So that's a big question, which many people have written very interestingly about. But it is, I do agree that it's a problem for the liberals right now and for the Democratic Party, practically speaking, right now.
Just one sentence, the decline of the labor movement, particularly in the private sector, is a big part of that.
That's a very good point.
Movement was a really powerful small d democratic egalitarian force. And I don't think progressives have fully recovered from that, from the difficulties the unions face.
I would say that, and I would also say the decline of schools as community institutions. And what has happened to school districts and secondary education in terms of how students are shuffled around, how students get into schools, how the family itself, in New York, there are kids who travel 90 minutes each way to go to public school. There's no way their parents can be fully involved in that school. And to quote Phyllis, she said, the most important vote you will ever cast is the vote for school board. And that focus on the local and the focus on the way the local anchors not just party politics, but the conversations, the democratic conversations we have with each other about how we sustain our lives. I do think the Democratic Party has had a role in breaking that. That's a longer conversation.
I mean, to be fair to the Democrats, I'll just say, I mean, it's easier to be a demagogue than a responsible leader. So I mean, you know, if you're willing to be a demagogue, if you're willing to throw facts and truth out the window, you can be pretty good at mobilizing people. And it's a little harder if it's a complex issue with cross-cutting currents and what exactly is your, you know, and you, I mean, so I think that's to be fair. I remember this. I'm sensitive to this because in 2016 there was a lot of, you know, can you believe how pathetic Jeb Bush is? Trump saw these issues out there. He saw immigration was a huge issue. He saw people were and Jeb Bush was unwilling. Well, unwilling to do what? Jeb Bush was unwilling to demonize people from Central America and from Mexico and unwilling to be a racist and a bigot. That's not a criticism of Jeb Bush, really. He understood those issues were powerful. He just wouldn't do that. And I do think, to be fair to the Democrats, I mean, some of it is that they are a decent party mostly that wants to do decent things and wants to make arguments based on what they take to be, you know, reasonably accurate and factual arguments, and they, you know, it's not their fault, as it were, that demagogues could be more successful.
Republicans have won the popular vote only once since 1992. I also think it's worth noting certain peculiarities to be charitable about our electoral system. Just had to throw that out there.
The other thing is that I do think that, I mean, maybe this is too long-term historical perspective, but the Democrats have been basically defending the New Deal post-war welfare state, and the Republicans have been in rebellion against it. And so in a sense, there's a built-in incentive for a kind of political conservatism. I mean, the Republican Party, I think, has been more politically creative because it's been very powerfully motivated against something. And being against something requires more creativity than simply defending what is. I mean, even if you think about the Voting Rights Act, we're defending 1965, or defending reproductive freedom. We're defending 1973, or, you know, defending the welfare state. We're defending the war on poverty, or, you know, or we're even defending the New Deal. So I think part of the reason why the parties have evolved in different ways has to do with the situation that they both faced. All of this is, by the way, analyzed in EJ's book, Why Americans Hate Politics. You know, this false polarization, but it begins from each of the sides is starting from a different place.
I want to propose that the thrust of this conversation is correct until yesterday, meaning that now we are actually attacking the actually existing authoritarian threat in the United States. And there's subtlety that's required, but there's also bluntness. You know, we're defending democracy from the left, right, and center. And it seems to me that this is an opportunity to engage in the same types of politics that the Republican Party used in opposition to the New Deal and the welfare state. So that's a simple proposition. I also, before I recognize Claire, I want to say that I think that one way we might start is actually distributing Phyllis Schlafly's declaration about school boards tomorrow. Claire.
Well, I mean, let me just say that my students actually love reading A Choice Not an Echo, because it's very rare that, I mean, they always say she has such unbelievable clarity about what she believes, and they love that about her. But let me also say, I think we're getting two things merged that we need to talk about distinctly. One is democracy as it is contained in the act of voting and the electoral process. And the other is a broader sense of what democracy is. And I would point to, for example, voter ID as one of those questions that gets these two things confused. There's no real reason to oppose voter ID except for the fact that our bureaucratic systems in the United States are set up to make it very difficult to get identification. A broader approach to democracy would not be to raise money saying the Republicans don't want your neighbors to vote, Claire, please give us more money now. The broader approach to it would be for a president to run and say, voter ID is not a terrible thing because actually people need identification to get bank accounts. They need identification to rent apartments. They need, you can't live a life in the United States without proper ID. You can't travel, right? So the question would be, why don't people have proper identification? And what would it mean for the federal government to guarantee that rather than pouring millions and millions of dollars into the fight against requiring voter ID?
They already gave up that fight, Claire. I mean, in the For the People Act, it allowed voter ID. The problem with voter ID is not what it is, as you say. It's only allowing certain forms of identification, like a driver's license, which leave out all kinds of people in the inner city who don't drive. Or extreme cases like Texas, where you could use a gun license, but you couldn't use a state-issued ID card from a university. So, if you show up Stacey Abrams said, "I'm fine with ID as long as it allows for a lot of forms of ID that don't disenfranchise people." So I think that that fight is past. But I do want to say, I mean, if I could say one word for the book Miles and I have coming out, we suggest that it's time for the US to adopt the Australian system of compulsory electoral participation, where we want everyone to vote. And one of the points we make, and we think that there are ways of doing this that could work well with the American system. Australia's been doing it for 100 years. And one of the arguments to Republicans about this is the 2020 election showed that if you made it easier to vote, if you increased turnout, that did not automatically hurt Republicans. Republicans picked up seats in the House of Representatives because their people came out in 2020 in many parts of the country when they didn't in 2018. And so I do think we need to go back to the democracy as system point. We need to be open to trying to have some kind of resolution of the problem. Do we want everybody in or do we not? And that's really the argument we need to have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would just say,
have not wanted everyone in.
Yeah, right, Jeff.
Oh, I just wanted, I think I really disagree with Claire about this, although I respect what she's saying. And the general point about the way in which, especially digital communication amplifies, oversimplifies, amplifies, gets people angry, gets them framing things in kind of like overly melodramatic ways. Those are all great points, and she's getting a lot more of those messages than I am, I think. But I think the big question, the two things. One is, Michael Waldman wrote this book, The Right to Vote. It was published in 2016. And I mean, in fact, there's a long Republican commitment to voter ID as part of a restrictive approach. And I don't think that, the problem is that too many Democrats and liberals are exaggerating the danger of voter ID. In fact, I would go so far as to say the real problem, and I think Bill would even agree with me on this, is the big lie. I mean, and I assume this is part of EJ and Miles's book as well. I mean, yes, there's no problem with a kind of voter ID, but the real thing is why is it so important to have it? Because of the claim that all these people who shouldn't be voting are voting, and that's a lie. So, and that's the fundamental problem, I think. I'm not sure whether you disagree with me, Claire, but I just wanted to say that.
I actually don't disagree with you, Jeff. I think the way I'm thinking about it is, why are we separating out voting from all of the other activities that are far more daily and far more social and economic that also are about living in a democracy? So that, for example, in New Haven, when I was living there, was the first city to introduce a local identification. And why were they doing it? Because undocumented people were getting robbed every Friday, because every criminal on the street knew that they didn't have bank accounts. They couldn't get bank accounts because they didn't have ID. So one way of reducing crime, and actually, if one thinks broadly, democratically, of the right to keep one's pay and not have it taken away by a thug, meant getting people ID. That also then increased the number of people who were American citizens in New Haven having IDs. So there's actually no restriction on voting in New Haven. They could enact a voter ID law tomorrow and everybody could still vote. So that's why I'm saying we get focused on these issues that are being pushed, and we don't say, okay, so what does the broader democratic society look like?
Yes.
But
Yeah,
I just
I-
don't
I'm
think
actually-
Democrats are hung up on that. I think that if you look at the provisions of the For the People Act, every one of them responds to an actual threat that could reduce participation. And I think, and Bill alluded to this earlier, I think one of the truly depressing things is we should be celebrating what we achieved in 2000. It was extraordinary what election officials did on the fly to create the highest turnout that we've had in forever, and probably in some ways the highest turnout ever in a broad electorate that doesn't have discriminatory features in it. And we ought to celebrate that. And instead, we have had to fight these skirmishes and something bigger than skirmishes against people trying to just make it a little harder here and there to vote, to the absurdity of Texas, where even election officials can't understand what the legislature did, and all kinds of people, including Republicans, got disenfranchised in their primary.
So I would like to pick up what Claire said and broaden it. So we've been focusing on voting and elections, and we're all very concerned about that. But then there's also this incredible puzzle for me, that is it 30%, 40%, 45% of the American population that is actually buying this authoritarianism, which is making it so that, I think we're agreed when we talked about the Republican Party, that in or out, that it has to be decisively defeated. So the challenge is, how do you decisively defeat the Republican Party when such a large portion of the population has actually abandoned its commitment to democratic ideals and principles and practices? How do we actually do that? So I think that one of the ways, which we've discussed, is that people on the left have to appreciate the kind of reflective, critical insight that people on the right have had, who've actually turned away from that. And we ought to actually note that, as EJ did, that it has ended this way, or we're in this situation, not just because of something that happened yesterday, but it's a long-term process. But I would propose that just as important is that people on the left need to understand why people are conservative. Why people Claire referred to this a little bit earlier on the everyday level, but also on the intellectual level. There's a long tradition of conservative insight and wisdom that we need to pay attention to, about the wisdom of custom, the insights that come from experience. I personally have to turn to my conservative teachers to actually fully appreciate that. Gramsci is interesting because he's a Marxist who sort of put that in, but it turns out the stuff that he put in has a source, and the source is actually very interesting. So I want, how do we actually defeat the Republican Party, but also convince our fellow citizens that democracy matters, that across the political spectrum? So I pose that to anyone who wants to speak. Claire, go ahead.
So Jeff, I won't go on and on, but I think we need to be careful about defining democracy in a way that excludes the MAGA Republicans. If you go to CPAC, they don't think they're anti-democracy. And so part of what we have to grapple with here is the shifting shifting definitions of what democracy is and what it's constituted by. So if you look at, for example, at the rise of the Tea Party after Obama's election, that's when we begin to see people using the word freedom over and over and over again as their definition of what democracy is.
Yes,
You know,
yes,
my
but
freedom, you know, and so I just think one place to start, and I don't want to push us backward in time, but it's not as if people on the far right, or indeed the far left, don't think they're in favor of democracy. They are not in favor of liberal democracy. And
Well, but that's why we crafted our letter as we did. And now another way of interpreting Jeff's question, which I think is consistent with like the way you want to think about this, Claire. And it's wonderful that like, seems to me that this whole event is now featuring you. I mean, literally, your face is like over my entire screen, and it's a wonderful face. And so it's nice to see you. I missed you actually. You know, is how and why it is that anti-liberal or illiberal conceptions of democracy have such a root. I think that's another way of interpreting Jeff's question.
yes, that's right. And I have to say that your response to me, Claire, leads me to remember the Stalinist or former Stalinist acquaintances I have from Poland and Eastern Europe. You know, so that of course they were Democrats too. This just you know, the illiberal democracy. Jeff is in a big debate whether illiberal democracy exists or if there is actually such a thing as democracy without liberalism. But you know, so let's take it. Yes, they think of themselves as being Democrats. They think of themselves as defending the Constitution. It's a distinctive defense of the Constitution. We, in principle, agree that they're wrong. I mean, I think on this there's actually absolute contestation, and that you know, we can convince people that they're mistaken, but in our judgment, I think we have to actually stand by our convictions. Maybe it's required to say, as Jeff suggested, we're defending liberal democracy, but I have friends who are liberals and who are Democrats and know that the two ideals should be united, but they won't call themselves liberal Democrats because they see that as being the actually existing liberal democratic system, which they are highly critical of. So that's another.
Let Claire respond. Oh,
yeah.
Claire's chatting a response. You should say it.
No, well, I was actually chatting with someone in the chat about something entirely different. So,
okay. So Bill, please.
Could I just say something real quick?
Yes.
I think we have always had a far right in the United States that constituted 15, 20, sometimes 25% of us. Go back to the charts in Marty Lipset and Earl Rabb's old book, The Politics of Unreason. That was published way back in 1973. And we're talking in some sense about the politics of unreason. So I just picked it up. It's May of last year, so it's a little out of date. The number may actually be somewhat lower now, but 25% of all Americans believe Trump won the 2020 election back then. Not 50%, not 40%, 25%. I think the political problem confronting us is another 20 to 25% of Americans will be willing to vote Republican despite all of the things we've talked about, because they're mad about inflation or they're mad about something out, gas prices or any number of other things. And young people won't vote in the numbers Democrats need because they're frustrated that Democrats couldn't pass all of their stuff. So that even I'm not worried about a great mass of Americans being anti-democratic. I do worry about the 20-25% who might say Trump won. I think that what we face is a rather old-fashioned political problem of persuasion. And I think one of the debates going on among Democrats and those who support them is to what extent should they make the fight about democracy central to the campaign? And would that be effectual? And there's great disagreement among people who run campaigns about whether I'm inclined to make it an issue because I think it's an issue. but an awful lot of very smart consultants say, no, if you talk about that, you're not going to talk to the people you need to win. But I don't think we face anything close to a majority of Americans who've gone over to the anti-liberal Democratic side.
We
Well,
do
I
face,
Go ahead.
well, just we do, but the 25% who, the other half the Republican Party who are willing to tolerate this, and probably actually it's a little worse than they just are willing to tolerate it and take their tax cuts.
Yes,
They
I
actually
agree with that.
sort of enjoy it, or they've come to enjoy it. This is the
Yeah.
danger once the toothpaste out of the tube. People tend to like demagoguery. They like a little bit of bullying. They wouldn't themselves quite do it, but they kind of don't mind if other people do it. So you can get on a very bad slope, which I think we are sort of on. This doesn't fundamentally challenge anything EJ said. I would say maybe across the board from, I don't know, what is the board? Social Democrats to liberal Democrats to Burkean conservatives, that kind of our traditional, the kind of thing Jeff was talking about. I think all of us probably underestimated the intrinsic fragility of liberalism in the broad sense of liberalism, of democracy in the broad sense of democracy. And that's partly the last 30 years, but really the last maybe 60, with all those books from the 50s and 60s, the authoritarian, the temptation of fascism, the true believer, they were serious, there were deep books and political philosophy, books in political philosophy by Hannah Arendt and so forth, and much more popular versions of this and psychological versions of this. But the kind of that temptation is not just in the US and not just, you see it. It's worth studying, of course, the John Birch Society and all that, because that's how it sort of manifests itself. But there's something in human beings that is, we all thought that the norm would be democracy of some form or another. And then we could argue from Burke to, whatever the leftmost range of sort of acceptable social democracy is, and didn't probably, and thought fascism had been defeated. Thought communism was a problem, obviously, but then it got defeated, and so Union at least, and was already intellectually kind of on its last legs. I think you could say strict, kind of that kind of style, Marxism, and maybe not fair to say Marxism. Let's just say Soviet communism, and we all maybe underestimated how much that is a permanent challenge and a problem. I mean, I don't want to go to too high a level of abstraction here, but it really is. That's what for me has been a lesson in the last few years. Stuff that I read as a kid and thought was very interesting, that was written 10 or 20 years before I was, reading this stuff in college, but, from the 50s and 60s is actually quite relevant. Why do people want to believe in and yes, there are particular things that then make it flare up and make it easier to peddle these lies, right? And probably, and this is where we get to the whole discussion of globalization and social media and a million other things. And maybe it was just a very bad coming together, a very unlucky almost coming together of a bunch of things at one moment. But whatever the luck or failure to be lucky, it's happened. And we have to deal with it. And I guess I am a little unnerved, I guess I would just say, maybe a little more than EJ in that respect. I take the point about the Electoral College and the system and the majorities and all that's true, of course. But I'm a little unnerved by the susceptibility in America in 2022. And for all that we can complain about neoliberalism and globalization and the war in Iraq and other failures, I mean, it's not the great, it's one thing in the 30s, 10 years after World War I, 15 years after World War I, in the Great Depression, and when everything looks like it's totally falling apart, for people to fall for this, and I could just be simple-minded about it. I'm a little freaked out by the fact that so many people are willing to fall for it in 2022, when even the unfortunates in our society, and I mean that in the kind of literal sense, the people who haven't been fortunate, are not suffering like in the 30s, and the degree to which that temptation to want to not be a decent citizen in a functioning democracy, that temptation is stronger than one thought. It's stronger in the US, where one thought maybe that there were more guardrails against it. So I don't know quite what this implies in terms of action. I think it does imply the need for this kind of broad coalition. It implies for also rethinking the kind of conditions of liberalism broadly understood, or democracy broadly understood, and thinking hard about things like, you can't fix everything all at once, right? And human nature is human nature. But I do agree very much with Claire on this. There are particular things that also we have allowed, and also with everyone really, that there are particular things, whether it's party politics or social media or economic inequalities, which have grown up, which have made a possibility more of an actuality in a very bad way.
It scares me too, but if at the risk of being what a Leninist might call a vulgar economist, vulgar economism, I do think the costs of the kind of globalization we had and deindustrialization really are part of this story. Because if you look at where Trump did well, where Le Pen does well, where the AfD does well in Germany, and just go around the globe, you clearly have places that have been hollowed out by economic change. And there is a sense of a loss of hope, partly because young people are leaving all these places, which is one of the reasons they've shifted politically, because there's no economic opportunity there. So I don't think we can understate the importance of economic change. And maybe just because I saw my Social Democrats from Germany yesterday, I think if you looked at Schulz's campaign, he was very focused on the need to respect those who have been hammered by economic change and the need for the Social Democrats to win some of them back. So I do think we can't leave out the economic factor as part of the problem we face.
If I could just say something.
But Jeff, then Claire, and
Oh.
then I'd like to say something too.
Okay, so two things. One is that I think there are two different levels of analysis here. There's the level of diagnosing the problem, which I think is very, very complicated in terms of historical path dependencies and kind of interacting causalities. And Claire, I think, has been pushing us to ask some deep questions about that. And then I think there's the question is what to do with the diagnosis. And there, I think things become much more problematic because it's very difficult to know what to do. And in fact, the sources of the problems are so interrelated and so profound that it's not, I do not think it is possible in any easy way or in any short to medium term political way to coordinate that and to really come up with a kind of mastery. I think about Walter Lippmann's drift in mastery and the progressive ideal. And I increasingly, and I want to just mention Todd again. So one of the things that Todd and I often talked about was Albert Camus, who is someone that we both loved. And in particular, we were
and
talking
whom Jeff wrote a brilliant book about, we should say, while we're talking books.
Go, EJ, go get it. Get it off your shelf now.
It is here somewhere.
Thank you, EJ. EJ actually blurbed it.
It's next to Phyllis Schlafly. It's kind of complicated.
Right. The myth of Sisyphus. And I really do think that, we're having a really profound discussion about lots of things. At the same time, from my vantage point, there are like two fundamental preoccupations I have. One is how to prevent the Republican Party from retaking Congress in like this year. And the other is how to help the people who are trying to defend themselves against Putin and the invasion. And those are both like putting your finger in the dike. If we were able to succeed there, something else is going to happen, then something else. And it's an ongoing push against what I think, unfortunately, is a kind of profound sense of obstacles that are always going to be there. And it's a very, in some ways, it's a very pessimistic view. I think Camus, what he said at one point was pessimistic as to mankind, he's optimistic as to man. Forgive me for the gendered language. But yeah, there's a source of hope in what we can do. But in terms of a macro solution, I'm very pessimistic.
By the way, I was only looking around, not because I wasn't paying attention. I was trying to find your book on my shelf, Jeff. I can't find it right away. Since I'm the Gramsciite here, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Yes.
Claire.
Well, I'm actually a great optimist. And, partly it's that I keep digging back into history saying, what went wrong? Where did we go wrong? And I think you can pinpoint any number of places where actually conservatives and liberals agreed with each other to disempower the government. And, if you look at the deregulation of the 1990s, it wasn't just that the economy was becoming globalized, it's that it was happening at the same time that we were abandoning regulation as a way to govern the economy, right? And so I remember having this conversation with my mother about Allentown. The other place I grew up was Philadelphia. And I said something about the closure of the steel plants and going to China and blah, blah, blah. She said they didn't go to China. They went to Minnesota. And so which I actually looked it up, and it was true that there was this kind of motion put in motion in the 1980s and 1990s, where American corporations were moving plants to other places in the United States so that they could get away from their unions and so on and so forth. So this is all a way of saying that, in fact, democracy, if it rests on a certain pact with the American people, that what the government is for is to protect your well-being and to protect your prosperity and to open doors to further prosperity, that failure was a failure of both Democrats and Republicans, of both liberals and conservatives. And I think returning to some of those originary moments to be able to speak to people whose lives have been affected generationally by those changes, and because of that, they no longer believe in government. And we actually have to have this bigger conversation about what is the relationship between democracy and governing, and how do you institutionalize democracy in governmental forms beyond the ways that are laid out for us in the Constitution. I mean, that's really a big part of the history of feminism, right? Before women could vote, what they did was reform things. and they believed that reform and government regulation was the basis for a much broader set of democratic values in society. I think those are good lessons for us to think about as we try to persuade people that they ought to have faith in our institutions.
Are you still working for the Danielle Allen campaign?
No, she dropped out because nobody knew who she was.
Exactly, because you were kind of articulating Danielle Allen's vision, and it's very powerful.
Right.
And the campaign doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of like, and I so am glad that you have more optimism than I do.
Well, you know, I'd like to kind of remind us in the last minutes that we have that the problems we're facing in the United States are echoed throughout the world. And the particular causes of the problems vary tremendously. So you know, as the old Marxist in me would say, it's not an accident that Putin and Trump were friends. You know, but the cause of Trump and the causes of Trump and the causes of Putin, I think actually were very, very different. So you know, there is this sense that the problems we face are global, that it's not 50% of the, you know, the percentage of the population in different countries that support this vary tremendously. And there is a coalition of the inflamed people who are kind of gladly, enthusiastically supporting the demagogues, and they're in coalition with the people who accept the demagogues. And I think it's always been the case that 10 to 30% of the American population was vulnerable to this, but it's that other part that leads to nearly 50% that is problematic. And I think that that's the case everywhere. And so I with that observation, I'd like to ask everyone here, each of you, to actually reflect upon the American experience as you think it's related to what's happening in other parts of the world. Bill, maybe you want to start?
I want to go first.
Jeff?
Let me go first
Jeff?
for
Okay.
this reason. I want to pay tribute to you, Jeff, and I want to promote the Democracy Seminar in a way that maybe you're too modest to do. And it's an effort that really Jeff has initiated, and along with Lala and an incredible staff has kind of like nurtured. And it involves a wide range of networking and meetings, mainly on Zoom, and webinars like this, and also the actual page, the platform, Democracy Seminar. And like right now, in the past week and a half, they have published an incredible amount of interesting stuff on Ukraine from all over the world, from Brazil, from Hungary, different perspectives, the US, Russia. And that kind of networking, I think, is a really important thing. It's not a direct answer to your question, but it's the way I would like to answer your question and encourage people to read Democracy Seminar, to participate, and also to salute Jeff Goldfarb, who's having a retirement event, 1 year belated this April. And I love Jeff Goldfarb.
Thank you. Me too, Jeff.
That's important.
Yes, but off me. Let's kind of think about and as we've been proceeding, the coalition against Putin is made up of very, very different sorts of people, and the both in Ukraine, beyond Ukraine, in Russia, and neighboring countries. There is a divide, which our colleague Andras Bozoki observed from Hungary. There's the opposition to Putin, which is centered on sovereignty and is friendly to nationalist populism. And there's the opposition to Putin that is actually concerned with democracy. And his prediction is actually that in Hungary, by the way, the battle is going to be not are you pro-Russian or anti-Russian or pro-Ukraine or anti-Ukraine, but ultimately it's going to be about democracy and democratic commitments. And I think that the coalitions that we're talking about, the ones that were represented by this letter, the ones that Todd Gitlin in the course of his life supported, are actually crucial at this point. If we can do it around specific issues in the concerning the electoral system in the United States or school board reform, that's great, but we actually have to realize that we're engaged in this struggle in a larger world. And importantly, and by the way, I think that the changes in Germany are astounding and really notable, because for years Germany took a very, very different kind of political path, and I think it's very significant for Europe and for the world that Germany is doing what it's doing now. Anyway, enough from me. Bill, would you like to offer your?
Just since we're, I guess, wrapping up, maybe three really brief points. I'll just say them in a kind of telegraphic way, but people will understand. Yeah, the Germany situation does remind us that things can change quickly, and it's very unpredictable when they do. And what's the joke about bankruptcy? It happens very slowly, and then it happens all at once. That just seems to be true. Lenin has that famous line about there's years of politics. I can't remember how it goes. Right? Politics moves, changes very slowly, and then there's decades of politics in a few days or something, or weeks. So, I mean, I do feel like we're at a moment, maybe an inflection point, both domestically and abroad, where things could get worse, a lot worse, and very bad things are happening, but also could get could change pretty radically. And so I'm sort of with EJ on that in terms of we shouldn't take all these current snapshots of the polls and of other things and the effects of social media and so forth as unchangeable, partly unchangeable by our own action, though. So we do need to do things. Second point, I do think just on the coalition point, I used to correct my conservative friends, I will say. I always had a little more appreciation maybe for the social democratic left than a lot of them who were writing books. And understandably, Reagan, Thatcher, Pope John Paul II, the coalition that won the Cold War and liberated Central and Eastern Europe. And I think there's some truth to that. But I would always say, look, if you want to think of it that way, it was a coalition of John Paul II and Havel, a secular, moderate, somewhat modernist playwright or whatever you want to call Havel, and a Catholic Pope. And in the American context, it was a coalition of the Reaganites, I would say, and of Helsinki and the human rights activists and Ostpolitik, if you want to use that as an example. And somehow people like me were much friendlier to certain aspects of the Cold War fight than to others, and thought it was Helsinki as kind of a concession to the Soviets in '75. Ostpolitik, are they really aware of what they're getting into? But I think in retrospect, every serious person would say that there was some case, each contributed something. The Ostpolitik side of things, and let's call it the Reaganite, defense buildup and talk of liberation side of things. So I think that might be a bit of a model, and that changed very suddenly too. I mean, I came to Washington in '85. Kind of assumed, I wasn't in foreign policy particularly, but I kind of assumed, well, what we conservatives are going to do for the next 20, 30 years is we're going to fight the Soviet Union and make sure we're tough enough to fight the Soviet Union here in the US. And 5 years later, the whole thing is gone. So things can change suddenly. Coalitions are always going to have disparate elements. Final point, you mentioned the world situation. Yeah, American exceptionalism, before it became, as everyone on this group knows, before it became this ridiculous slogan of the right, I could say American exceptionalism was an actual analytical thing in social science. And from Marty, I guess Marty Lipset, if I'm not mistaken, made it famous here, but it really comes from what Sombert and various German sociologists from 1915 or something, or earlier, I guess, right? But then it becomes, so why did we seem less susceptible to communism on the one hand and fascism on the other? We didn't have a big party on the left or on the right quite the way the European countries did. I think for me, one lesson of the last few years, and this will allow me to close on a slightly optimistic note, is the limits of American exceptionalism. I do think, I mean, it's not an accident that some of the shrewdest analysts of Trump and Trumpism and what's been happening here for the last decade or so are students of comparative politics, I think, not the Americanists, if I can go back to my political science, the fields within political science. And some of the historians of fascism, now you can argue maybe the historians of European fascism want too much to see it as European fascism and blah, blah, blah. But still, I think there's been a ton, I've learned personally a lot from people who were not in my areas exactly of the political science that I studied. And I think there's a real lesson there. But there's also probably positive lessons to be learned of, it's not, Germany has plenty of people on both sides who are victims of globalization and were susceptible to the right and the left in the last 10 years. They have a different electoral system. Maybe that's something we should think about. But in any case, they also had different political leadership, and they ended up marginalizing to some degree, 12-15% on the right, 12-15% on the left, and 70% in the middle are basically governing the country, and I think doing an adequate job. And that's true in a lot of European countries. So I think the end of American exceptionalism can both be a problematic in some ways, I suppose, but it can be a healthy thing to disabuse ourselves of the assumption that we're somehow immune from this. We've inherited something that we don't have to worry about as much. We don't have to worry about democracy as much as all those people in these other countries who don't have we have a good history. I mean, bad history too, but we have very fortunate history in many ways. But it doesn't make us immune to the same challenges that other countries face now and other countries have faced throughout the last century.
Thank you. I saw Claire shaking her head vigorously, so maybe I'll ask her to say her last words right now.
Well, I was actually, everything Bill said, I absolutely agree with. And I'm about to say something much less high-minded. Which is, I think, the comparison between where we are and where the Ukrainian-Russian situation is right now. One thing I want people to think seriously about is the shift in what constitutes propaganda. EJ said, he's more of a Gramscian perhaps than the rest of us. I would say the shift of the propaganda machine from not just being a state-centered top-down operation, that it is now state-centered and it is now grassroots. And both the distinctions between those two have to be understood, but the ways in which one masquerades as the other have to be understood. And I think, all of these congressional hearings we have had on social media have really not revealed any path forward for how we limit and perhaps even exclude the distribution of propaganda. And so I think even though the systems are different, Putin's machine is different. I find it both exhilarating and terrifying that the communication system in Russia is so dependent on social media right now that actually shutting it down means that Russians can no longer talk to each other about the war, much less receive information from the rest of us. So I think this moment has actually shown us the limits of a global information system in very, very graphic ways that actually build on the ways that the nationalist populist right has used our social media system to distribute its own propaganda.
So we're running out of time. EJ?
Real quick, first, underscore Claire's point. It's the paradox of the new information environment. All kinds of problems created by social media. And yet, we also see that when the state does what Putin is doing in Russia and shuts down all of this freedom, people are getting basically only propaganda. And how do we think that through? I'm counting on Claire's next book. Second, I couldn't agree more with Bill in terms of comparativists. It is no accident, to follow you, Jeff, that the Ziblatt and Levitsky book, Why Democracies Die, I think was so important. They are both comparativists. They have both looked at how these developments over recent years have matched other developments in the past elsewhere. I would shout out Benjamin Carter-Hett's book on the collapse of Weimar as another particularly instructive book of the moment. Big picture, if you didn't think democracy was on the line before Putin invaded Ukraine, take a look at what Putin did in Ukraine and see what this right-wing authoritarianism, you might even call it fascism if you wish, means for the world. And let's just face that and think about its meaning, whatever we think about increasing the defense budget or not. Last two points. I still don't think we'll solve these problems without some system reform and without social reform. And again, to go back to my vulgar economism, all these crazy things don't happen without some kinds of discontent that need a response. What John Judas said about populism, it's always a symptom of discontent that an establishment isn't dealing with. And we got to figure out how to deal with it in an egalitarian, and I mean egalitarian in all senses, race, gender, and class, in an egalitarian and effective way. And I just want to thank you, Jeff, and everyone else on this call. And God bless Todd Gitlin, whom we all miss.
That's a great place to end. I want to thank the four of you for taking part in this discussion. I learned a lot. Thank the audience for listening in to our conversation and joining with question and answers. I apologize to Dan Cole, who wanted to ask a question about the Supreme Court and what do we do given what's happened with the Supreme Court. That will have to be the topic of another discussion. Really, thank you all, and that's a wrap.